Hello and welcome to the Beneverse Movie Channel, where for this month or for September, October, we are talking the filmography of the one and only Martin Scorsese. And I needed to find somebody for this specific episode, for this movie that we're talking about, who matches the greatness, the energy, the enthusiasm that I have for Martin Scorsese. He's been a guest of this show before. You know him, you love him. We have today on this show entertainment journalist and film critic, Mr. Scott Mantz.
What is happening? I am so excited. Just so everybody knows, when Ben sent me the email request to talk about The Color of Money, I swear to God, I felt like this was the answer to my prayers, because The Color of Money is one of my all-time favorite movies, not just Scorsese movies, but I watch this movie every so often. I always try to do a double feature with The Hustler and The Color of Money. I just adore both of these films for completely different reasons. It is an honor to be on your show, Ben. I think I just trumped you because I said what the movie was before you did.
No, you're totally good. This movie that we are talking about is The Color of Money. Scott, when I emailed you, and I think it was a few months ago at this point when I reached out to you, and I had asked because, I was trying to book guests, and when you're going through all 26, you're trying to figure out okay, what movie do I want to ask for each one? And there were two really obvious ones. It was Jeff Snyder, who came on for The Departed, and it was you who came on, and I'm like, Tom Cruise, there is a Tom Cruise movie in Scorsese's filmography, Paul Newman. I just have to ask Scott, and you graciously accepted right away. You were like, I am so enthusiastic. I love this idea. Let's do it. And so I'm honored to, like I said, have you on today because, like I said, I know you're just not only just a big fan of Scorsese's work, but also just we got to talk about the guy today, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about him today. Tom Cruise. This is the guy in this movie. But Scott, before we get any real further, I know you as film critic, entertainment journalist. I wanted to ask you, and I know last time you came on this show, we kind of talked about this, but we didn't focus on this guy specifically, Marty Scorsese, that we're talking about today. What is your obviously you're a huge movie fan, but what's your relationship with the filmography and the person Martin Scorsese?
I just think that Scorsese, the fact that at this stage of his life and his career, that he is still turning out movies, that he's still challenging himself, that he's still doing feature films and documentaries, sometimes in the same year. This is a legendary filmmaker who, I'm sure everybody who kind of knows me knows that in addition to movies, I am also a massive diehard Beatles fan. So when I say that when Martin Scorsese comes out with the new movie, I look at that as the Beatles coming out with a new album. Well, the Beatles don't come out with new albums anymore. So Martin Scorsese coming out with a new movie, that's as good as it gets. And the fact that he is still challenging himself and his audience, because, he is also pushing the limits with his running times of his movies. Of course, The Irishman was 3.5 hours. Killers of the Flower Moon is about the same amount of time. I don't care. People say that Scorsese's movies are too long. I say they're not long enough. I love it. But, there's a, in terms of my relationship with Scorsese, Ben, it's one that has grown and evolved over the years, just like my knowledge of film, my love of film, my, understanding of all the different filmmakers and directors and writers and actors and actresses. But my relationship with Scorsese really started in 1980. My parents, they didn't really intend it to be this way, Ben, but they took me to a lot of movies that I was way too young to be going to. One of them being Jaws, another being The Shining, and in terms of Scorsese, another being Raging Bull. So, to be 11 years old, seeing a movie like that, that was definitely, I didn't know what I was watching. But, of course, as I got older, throughout the 80s and got into high school and everything, and, then you got other Scorsese movies coming out new, like King of Comedy and After Hours, and the movie we're talking about today, and Last Temptation of Christ. And here we are in 2023. He's got a brand new movie coming out to tie in with your focus on him, which is Killers of the Flower Moon. And I think that's pretty freaking cool.
There's 2 points of that I find so interesting. One, you identified something with Scorsese that I actually haven't thought about a lot, but you totally do like recognize it. And it is the idea that like he is our rock star equivalent for movie directors. Like, and I mean that literally quite in the way he edits and directs his movies. Like the way he chooses to tell it is like a Beatles album or like any of the great rock artists. Like there's just a kind of rhythm and style. It's so inspired by jazz and the blues. Like, and it's like, you know, it's a fusion of all of his rock and roll sensibilities, which is, you know, like, it's kind of a really impressive thing. And the other factor of that is like, he's been able to, and I thought about this morning when I was like rewatching scenes from Color of Money, because I watched it last night. I then decided to just kind of breeze through and watch a few scenes again this morning before prepping up for this. And the one element of it that I was so like shocked about when thinking about it is I'm like, you know, where I forget where this falls. I think this is like his 9th feature film or something like that. Maybe it's his 10th. But like at this point, when The Color of Money is released, he's been working in 3 decades. Now, he only made 1 film that was theatrically of any sort of theatrical release in the 1960s. But up until the year 2023, he's been working in 7 decades. Like he has released the movie in 7 decades. The longevity of his career and the fact that in each decade, he makes something so culturally significant that kind of defines what it is to be cool is kind of wild to me. Like this is a guy who has his fingers so on the zeitgeist and just understands how to utilize it.
Oh, for sure. Well, first of all, in terms of Scorsese being a rock and roll director, for one thing, he has directed documentaries about rock and roll, you know, legends like the band with The Last Waltz, the Rolling Stones, George Harrison, Bob Dylan. But then when you look at this very stylized films like Goodfellas and, you know, of course, Raging Bull, but also Casino and The Wolf of Wall Street, those are absolutely rock and roll movies. So you're right on point with that observation, Ben. The other observation is, yeah, you're right. Every decade, you know, he has at least 1 film, usually more, but, you know, in more recent years, you know, certainly the 21st century, you know, he's had at least 1 film per decade that is a seminal Scorsese essential classic. You know, the first decade of the 2000s, you had The Departed. You know, the second decade, you had, you know, Wolf of Wall Street. And now this decade, I mean, could it be, you know, Killers of the Flower Moon? I guess we'll find out. You know, I wish I'd seen it at Cannes, but I wasn't there. Of course, you know, the night is young. It's only 2023. He's got a whole, you know, 6 more years after this to, you know, do that rock and roll film.
Let's talk about like The Color of Money specifically, because obviously I'm not alive when The Color of Money comes out. This isn't even one that I realized was Scorsese until much later. Like I always knew this movie as a Tom Cruise movie and a Paul Newman movie before I actually fully knew that it was a Scorsese movie. Maybe I had read that it was a Scorsese movie at one point, but it wasn't one of the ones like it wasn't one of the ones that came to my mind. So in I believe this is 86, correct?
Correct. All right. So The Color of Money came out on October 17th, 1986. It cost $14.5 million to make. It was shot, principal photography rather, was 49 days. And the total domestic gross of this movie was $52.3 million. Now, you might look at that and go, oh, that doesn't seem like a lot of money. But not only for 1986 was it a lot of money, but considering that the cost of the movie was only $14.5 million, you know, probably cost another, you know, maybe 20 million to market. You're talking about a film that was in the black. You know, it did turn a profit. Now, the other thing is that, you know, when I saw the film in 1986, I didn't see it in October of 86. I saw it in December, and I remember it was December because it was after Thanksgiving, and the movie already had its first run in like the prime movie theaters. So I saw it at a sort of like discounted movie theater. I grew up in Philadelphia, so I saw the movie at a discounted movie theater in Kensington, which is a really, well, just going to be nice about it and say that it's not a very nice part of Philly. Maybe it is now, but you know, when I was growing up in the 80s and I was still living there, it was not really, you know, like top notch. But that's where I saw the film. I saw it with a bunch of friends. And now my entry point to The Color of Money, Ben, was not Scorsese. It was not even Paul Newman, who I'd already been a fan of by that point. My entry point to The Color of Money, you already touched on this, is Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
Because, Ben, 1986 was it was the year that made Tom Cruise a superstar, because here you had The Color of Money opening on October 17th, 1986. It is literally exactly 5 months after Top Gun came out. And if Risky Business in 1983 made Tom Cruise famous, it was Top Gun that made him a bona fide superstar, and he has been a superstar ever since. So Tom Cruise was my point of connection to The Color of Money. Even though I knew Scorsese and even though I knew Paul Newman, it was Tom Cruise that brought me in. And the other reason that he brought me into that is because for many years before that and many years after that, Tom Cruise could have easily taken on these like big sort of like popcorn type, blockbuster type of roles. But look at 1980, you know, after 1983, when he does Risky Business, he does Legend with Ridley Scott. The same year he does Top Gun with Tony Scott. He does The Color of Money with Paul Newman and Martin Scorsese. The same year he did Cocktail in 1988. He did Rain Man with Barry Levinson. And then the year after that, he does Born on the 4th of July with friggin' Oliver Stone. So here's an actor who is strategic in making movies that he knows the public is really going to love, but also movies that are going to challenge him as an actor. The Color of Money did that, and friggin' he held his own with Paul Newman in that film.
You mentioned one thing that specifically that I actually just pulled up. It's actually in my notes as well. It's the Tom Cruise filmography, his director list. And I don't love reading lists on my podcast, but I'm going to do it because this is so impressive.
Yep.
Tom Cruise's filmography, if you look at like really the biggest names that he's worked with as an actor, I think he's been in 44 feature films. He has worked in The Outsiders is obviously like really one of his first starring roles, Francis Ford Coppola, Ridley Scott, as you mentioned, Tony Scott twice, Martin Scorsese, Barry Levinson, Oliver Stone, Ron Howard, Rob Reiner, Sidney Pollack, Neil Jordan, Brian De Palma, Cameron Crowe twice, Kubrick, Paul Thomas Anderson, John Woo, Spielberg twice, Edward Zwick, Michael Mann, J.J. Abrams, Robert Redford, James Mangold, and Doug Liman. Those are like a list of A-list directors.
That is an incredible list of directors to seek out. And you know what, Ben? You know who else is really good about picking the right directors to work with? Someone who is bucking the trend of like, you know, going for like typical blockbuster, you know, sort of heartthrob kind of roles is DiCaprio. DiCaprio has worked with the same very, very impressive list. Like if you look at the list of directors that DiCaprio has worked with, it's like he's saying, who's the best director in the world? And he's like checking off all these names, like many of them you just said. You know, unfortunately, DiCaprio never worked with Stanley Kubrick, but Tom Cruise did.
I think it's like kind of the big focus point, at least for the Tom Cruise element of this. And I think that's what makes him essentially a movie star. Like, really like the difference between, and I was trying to then compare it. I'm like, who's a really big movie star now? And I thought of like The Rock, right? Like The Rock. But if you look at his filmography, like the directors he's chosen to work with, his biggest names are really Peter Berg, F. Gary Gray, Adam McKay, Justin Lin, Michael Bay. Like those are really like at the very least somewhat equivalent of an A-list director. Like that's just not the run. And that's like, I think like the thing that we're kind of missing, like, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio is kind of the perfect example with Tom Cruise. Like Leo picks it. Even like what made Schwarzenegger big in the 80s was like, he's making these action movies, but he's making them with like James Cameron. He's making them with like Paul Verhoeven. He's making them with, I'm blanking on the director of Predator right now. John
McTiernan.
John McTiernan. Like that is kind of the difference. And it's kind of the really impressive thing about Color of Money is just like the cruiseness of this movie. And I guess that's kind of where we can jump into this movie, because this is also kind of, again, this is how I had known Tom Cruise in this role, was from The Color of Money. Specifically, like I had known The Color of Money to be kind of a quintessential early Tom Cruise performance. Sure. I think there's probably like 3 years that really define Tom Cruise as a movie star. It's probably 1986 with Top Gun, Color of Money. It's probably his most important year. It's probably 1995 with Mission Impossible, Jerry Maguire.
86.
96?
96, yeah.
96. And then it's 1999 where he does Paul Thomas Anderson and Stanley Kubrick in the same year.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely, like, for sure.
So those are three such important like years for his filmography. And like I said, the fact that this is Top Gun and Color of Money is such a wild thing to discuss. But let's just kind of get into this movie. This was a interesting experience for me because, you know, I'd never actually seen this film up until yesterday. This was one of those weird, like, I love Tom Cruise. I love Marty Scorsese. And that's probably a lie. I've probably seen on TV over the years. Like, I'm sure growing up, I probably had seen the whole movie, but just in different, like, kind of chunks.
Sure.
And so this was my first time actually sitting down and, like, from beginning to end, I will watch it as intended. And the element that like surprised me while watching The Color of Money was just the cruise of it all. Like, this was such an electric performance from Tom Cruise. And I couldn't get over how Marty filmed both his movie stars, like Paul Newman, Tom Cruise. There was such a reverence that Scorsese has with the camera when it's pointing to Paul Newman. And it's also kind of this insight where he's like, Cruise has what Newman has, and let's capture that. It's really the first time in Tom Cruise's career that he really is like, and Top Gun is obviously another very movie star performance, but this is really a movie star. This, you know, Scorsese's filming him before he's a solidified movie star. And he just sees that this guy has the chops, and he has the chops in this movie.
Absolutely, he does, Ben. I mean, the way I would put it is that in Top Gun, Tom Cruise is a movie star. In The Color of Money, Tom Cruise is an actor. And that does not take anything away from his performance in Top Gun, because he was very good for what that role called for. And he was, you know, fantastic in Maverick. That was also an amazing performance. But you know, first of all, so The Color of Money was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. It won 1, and that Academy Award was for Paul Newman. It was nominated for 3 other Academy Awards, one of them being for Richard Price, Best Adapted Screenplay, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio for Supporting Actor, and Best Art Direction and Set Direction. So, and that it's interesting to note that when Paul Newman won for this role, it was the only time he ever won an Oscar in a competitive acting category. And this was a year after Paul Newman was given an honorary Oscar. Maybe they thought, you know, after all these nominations for The Hustler and for The Verdict, that, you know, maybe he's just not going to win. So they gave him an honorary award. Color of Money comes out and they're like, oh my God, Paul Newman is fantastic. So they gave him an Oscar. And just over these years, Ben, so many people have said, well, you know, did Paul Newman really deserve to win the Oscar for The Color of Money when he should have probably won for, let's say, The Verdict? Well, yeah, because when you watch The Color of Money now, whether you're watching it someone like me who's seen it like 30 times or someone like you, and I'm just curious to know, I think that is absolutely hands down from top to bottom an Oscar-worthy performance deserving of the win. It wasn't like The Departed when Scorsese won Best Director and that wasn't his best film. You know, he should have won for Taxi Driver, Goodfellas, or Raging Bull. They gave it to him for The Departed because he had not won a Best Director Oscar yet. And I love The Departed. It's in my top 5. But Color of Money, Eddie Felson, and to play a character like Eddie Felson, so different than the way he played it in 1961, 25 years earlier for The Hustler, I think Paul Newman's performance is magnificent. And yet The Color of Money as a film is probably the most straightforward and dialed back movie Scorsese ever made. It's not right. It's not stylized. It's very, chronologically moving forward, maybe a couple of, there's a couple camera tricks with the, shooting the pool and shooting the balls and, the Werewolves of London scene, which is a great scene.
We'll talk about that. And
don't you think that it's a straightforward movie?
It's a very linear told movie. Like, this is one where when I was watching it, like, it is very much like I've heard the comp of this basically being a sports movie. That is essentially what it is in structure. There is a little bit of like, when I was watching the movie, kind of what surprised me is, and it's kind of what Scorsese's so interested in during the 80s, is it's a very atmospheric movie. Like, he really brings out the dynamics of dark pools. Like, that is like they're usually poorly lit, they're in bars. Like, he makes something cinematic out of something that probably typically you wouldn't really think as cinematic. What's interesting is when you were talking about like that year's Academy Awards, because if I'm correct, I believe this is indeed the Platoon year, which is of course like a movie that gets a lot of wins but doesn't really have performances in the acting categories outside of Best Supporting Actor. Defoe and I want to say Berenger get nominated. They definitely do for that. Like, if you look at the Best Actor race that year, it's Paul Newman, it's Dexter Gordon for Round Midnight, Bob Hoskins for Mona Lisa, William Hurt for Children's of a Lesser God, and James Wood for Salvador. Like, what's kind of crazy about the Newman thing, and you kind of touched on this, is like the question of this, is this his makeup Oscar? And it's hard to say that out of those 5 performances that Newman doesn't he isn't the best performance in that. Like, he is, like, to me, definitively. I think James Wood is actually pretty good in Salvador. I think Bob Hoskins in Mona Lisa is like another really great.
And Children of a Lesser God for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, there's some really special, there's some really special performances in there, but it is also like, this is kind of Paul Newman kind of playing quintessential Paul Newman to a degree. It's kind of crazy. Like, if you look at each year where Paul Newman is nominated, it's just like, oh, how did he lose? And it's like, oh, well, this is the year that like In the Heat of the Night wins. Or like, this is the year where he goes up against, I want to say, who does he lose to in The Verdict? Do you remember off the top of your head?
Ben Kingsley.
It was to Ben Kingsley for Gandhi, right?
Yeah.
Like, his competition has always been stiff, and he finally found the one year where it was just like, it kind of seems like it has to be Newman. Yeah. And it's a really, I think the thing that I find so interesting about this is it's like not my favorite Paul Newman performance. Like, I think he has done 5 better performances in that, but that's not to say that this is by any means a bad Paul Newman performance. I actually think he's quite special. It's just like kind of like the crazy thing with the revisionist history of when you look at it, and it's just like, how did he not get nominated for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Like, how is that possible in any world that he doesn't like just win that year's Oscar? But when watching this movie, what amazed me about the performance that Newman gives in it is it is such a self-aware performance. Like, he is very much aware of like, this is Tom Cruise going to kind of overstep me. Like, this is kind of me dialing it back. And he's playing he's playing a guy who is essentially a little bit, he plays older than I think he is in real life at the time of this movie. Like he does feel like he's a little bit older, like close to retirement. In reality, I think Newman's like 50 when he makes this movie. Like it's just all these elements that I find so interesting with the Newman performance.
Well, so first of all, what you have is a movie where Eddie Felson is, he has his moments where he fears he's getting upstaged by Vincent. And Vincent is showing off, and that pisses off Eddie. One point, when they're in the pool hall, one of the pool halls, Vincent's like, going around the pool table, knocking the balls in without even looking at him. And he's saying, there's a lot of people doing it. It's a lot of people doing it, but only one can be the best. And Eddie turns around, he walks away, gets in the car, and he drives off. Well, I think there's something to be said about Paul Newman, the actor, sort of connecting to Eddie Felson in that way of Vincent is Tom Cruise and Paul Newman is or rather Eddie is Paul Newman. And we're going to get into our favorite scenes.
Yeah.
But I just think that as a character study, like this is not really a sequel to The Hustler, in a sense that, other than he's obviously he's playing Fast Eddie Felson, but he only makes one mention of something that happened 25 years ago. And he says, I never think about it. It's in the past. But he's pivoted to a life selling liquor that has been very good to him. He is pivoted to a life of like he says to Carmen, he says, you know what this represents? Excellence. And then he sees this guy and he remembers who he was. It's like he rediscovers his love of life, which was, playing pool, and it's an incredible arc. And there's really no other character study quite like Fast Eddie Felson and The Color Money in any of Scorsese's movies. I mean, certainly, Travis Bickle, Rupert Pupkin, none of Jesus Christ, none of these people have anything really in common, I think, with Eddie Felson. But yet it's an incredible performance. It's an incredible arc of a character within this film, and we'll get into why when we get into our favorite scenes.
There's like this element of this movie that I found so interesting with the Newman performance that you touched on is like kind of the film's ending, which we're going to spoil this movie. This film ends with a Paul Newman as Eddie Felson kind of rediscovered himself. Like he's found the joy of life again, which is very kind of not what you'd expect out of a Scorsese film. Like typically by the end of the Scorsese, like operatic nature of Taxi Driver, of King of Comedy, of Goodfellas. Well, I guess you could probably remove King of Comedy out there, of Last Temptation, Departed. Like these are all characters who are going to just eventually kind of crash and burn to some degree, or they're going to get lost in their own violence, as in the case of like Travis Bickle. This is a guy who like really finds just kind of the sweetness of life and is moving away from I wouldn't necessarily call it immaturity, but it's certainly the hustling element. Like at the end, he is just truly like Eddie Felson. He's no longer Fast Eddie. He's a guy that's just kind of rediscovered his love for something that he had lost because he was so caught up in the kind of greed of life.
Well, the lesson of The Hustler was that he won the game, but he lost the war.
Mm-hmm.
Because, what happened to, look what happened to his life. And, he gets into his relationship with Piper Laurie and, she kills herself. And, he goes back to play Minnesota Fats one last time. And, he plays him into the ground where Fats surrenders, says, you win, Eddie. I can't beat you. And then, you've got the George C. Scott character saying, you owe me money. And he goes, I'm not giving you a dime. He goes, well, you better stay out of these pool halls or I'm going to break your arms. And, he looks at Minnesota Fats and says, you shoot a great game of pool, Fat Man. And looks up and says, so do you, Fast Eddie. And that's it.
It's the exciting thing of when we then get into Color of Money. It's like I always love to see when an actor ages in that same role. I think it's something that's really exciting with Tom Cruise when he goes from Maverick in 1985 to then go to Maverick in 2022. Like just how they interpret their basically the past 40 years that we haven't seen on screen. And with Paul Newman coming back for Color of Money, what I love so much about this performance that Paul Newman gives is when he meets Tom Cruise, when he meets Vincent in this movie, you can see the reflection, like you can see Eddie seeing Vincent in his eyes. Like you can see where he's like, oh, Vincent's kind of like me. Like he has this kind of style, he's this street cred.
Here's the thing, Ben.
Mm.
Eddie doesn't see Vincent. He hears him.
Mm-hmm.
He hears him first. He hears the break.
Yeah.
Because, he's talking to his girlfriend, about liquor and, just totally relaxed. And then in the other room, he's got his back to, where the pool table is. He hears Vincent break and he goes, that kid's got an incredible break.
Yeah. Turns
around and then he is totally ignoring his girlfriend and she's like finishing a sentence and he kind of like blows her off like, yeah, that's the moment. That's his inciting incident. That's when he hears something he has not felt in 25 years.
Yeah, it's something really special. Like when they finally like meet and you see the training and you kind of see like you take the character of Vincent with Tom Cruise, like you see kind of like it's not necessarily a coming of age story, but it's kind of innocent lost, right? Like this is a kid who is doing this for the love of the game. And then by the end of the movie, he's like, I'm going to throw the game to get like $4,000, $8,000, whatever the amount of money is. Like it is that reflection. And then it's like kind of Eddie then having to reflect on that, like, oh my God, I took something so pure for this kid and made it, greedy. Like, and I think that was such a fascinating element of this movie. I guess let's just kind of like jump into certain scenes of this movie. I want to ask you what your favorite scene of this movie is, but I feel like it's obvious. So may I guess?
Here's what I want to do, Ben.
Okay.
Is I think what strikes me about The Color of Money is that you have these two characters, Eddie Felson and Vincent, who are both extremely confident, but in completely different ways.
Mm.
Vincent is confident, but he's also kind of clueless, at least he is until Eddie takes him under his wing. But then you see the way that Eddie is confident, and the way that he's just totally charmed his girlfriend and the way when he takes Vincent and Carmen out to dinner and he says, he kind of sets it up and says, oh, this girl's gonna, turn the guy down. The guy's gonna walk out in 1 minute. Like there's a confidence there. Mm-hmm. And then the moment when Eddie goes to see Vincent at his, the place that he works, Baby World, whatever it's called. And he's like kind of playing with his head saying, you're going to lose Carmen if you stay here. And, and Vincent being just obviously a very, very, insecure, jealous person, that really pushes his buttons. Mm-hmm. But then when Eddie is walking out, you've got that classic Scorsese shot.
Yeah. Oh, and it's so beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's the way Eddie is walking out, the camera, which is down by Eddie's waist, zooms in, and Eddie turns around real fast and says, Vincent, don't worry about it. It's
to me, that's kind of the movie star moment for Tom Cruise, where it's just like, yeah, you trust him. He's got this. Like, there is something like so special. And I find this movie particularly like really like dynamic for the way of how they utilize charisma with the characters of Eddie and Vincent, because Paul Newman and Tom Cruise are two of the most charismatic actors of all time. They're very charismatic for very different reasons.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise has the biggest, goofiest smile in the world. And it's that just charm of the confidence in himself, that just like sheer joy, excitement, belief. The fact that we're watching Tom Cruise actually play in this movie, like we are watching him, actually break, like do all this, like that commitment of Tom Cruise is kind of where the charisma comes. Where Paul Newman has always been a far more laid back, chill, like he's not somebody that like you typically see smile in movies, and it's especially not to the degree that Tom Cruise does. It's the difference of the fact that Tom Cruise can wear a shirt that says his name in the movie, Vincent, big letters, and you would never see a Paul Newman character do that. And it's how those two juxtaposed with each other is where that dynamic becomes so special. And it's where Scorsese fully understands as a director how to utilize movie star charisma, because not every movie star is the same and not every level of charisma is the same. And it's those two ideas coexisting, but also just internally different. It's oil and water. They can't really coexist together based on that, because they're not two people who would probably really like each other.
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, does Eddie like Vincent? I mean, I think Vincent likes Eddie, but
I think Vincent likes everybody is kind of like the idea.
Yeah,
like he's just so easygoing, like so happy. I think Paul Newman's Eddie like respects the work of Vincent, but he doesn't necessarily like love hanging out with him.
Right. I agree with you, especially because Vincent doesn't really listen to him. He's trying to be a father figure, but Vincent is not, being the son that Eddie never had, so to speak. He wants him to be, but it's not happening. And, I think like the key moment, which leads to, what is inarguably the best scene in terms of just being the best stage scene is, after, Vincent is showing off, and then Eddie leaves, and then Eddie realizes that back at the motel that Vincent took the balabushka, that he went back to the pool hall, and he's like, oh my God, children. It's like babysitting children. And then, he goes back, and there's, Vincent is commanding the room, and he just like has that room. And, Warren Zevon's Werewolves in London is playing, and he's just going around that table, and the camera is following him. The camera's on this dolly that's just circling the pool table. I wonder how many takes that took, but it's just a great scene. It's the scene that everybody knows from that movie. Even if you've never seen The Color of Money, the Werewolves of London scene, but it's not my favorite scene of the movie.
Really? Okay. Let me talk about the Werewolves of London scene just real quickly before we move on from it. This was the most exciting scene to me. I couldn't believe how much cinematic dynamite was just in the way this camera moves and the way Tom Cruise does it. The fact that like it is this specific scene could have been such a disaster for Cruise. Like he could have come off as such a douche. Like there's so much that just could have really felt wrong about this scene, and really just like been like, Vincent's really annoying. And this is like, to me, like more than anything that has come before Tom Cruise's career, that's again not to disregard Top Gun or to disregard anything like From Risky Business. This is such a beautifully just edited scene by Scorsese's longtime editor, Thelma Schoonmaker. Richard Price's story, Martin Scorsese's direction, all of that just kind of coming together, and it's all centrally focused on Tom Cruise dancing to Werewolves of London. And it's such an exciting scene. This is the scene that I like. This morning I rewatched it like 5 times. It's such an easy scene to rewatch, and it's so absolutely charming. The way he just like, there's a scene where it's just like, there's a line in the song that I'm blanking on the exact line, but it says, "Oh, his hair is perfect." And Tom Cruise, like, does it.
He puts his fingers through his hair, and he snaps his finger, and he does that. Oh, Werewolves of London.
It's such a dynamic movie star performance, and it was at this moment where I'm just like, I'd have to think everyone in the world who saw that moment was just like, this is it. Like, this is our movie star. Like, we have the biggest movie star in the world.
I remember when I saw the movie for the first time that December of 1986. This guy I grew up with, he got up and he started dancing to Werewolves of London when that scene was playing. Yeah, man. Yeah, no, that was an amazing scene to see it for the first time, which you just did the other day, which is like crazy. But the appeal of this movie, though, as great as Tom Cruise is when you watch someone who was seemingly at the top of their game get knocked off their perch, fall flat on their back, get up, brush themselves off, and move forward again, pick themselves up. An underdog at a later stage of the game. And I got to tell you, Ben, the thing about perspective, I love this movie when it came out in 86, and I've watched it many, many times over the years. But in more recent years, I have to say that I grew to relate to The Color of Money in ways that I never thought would happen. Where you get to be a certain age and someone looks up to you as a role model of sorts, as a teacher, only to surpass you. And that is what happens to Eddie by Vincent in this movie. Vincent surpasses him. And even though Vincent, blows it purposely, and Eddie doesn't like that, we all know about that. But this is something that just in more recent years, maybe 5 years, I came to relate and to understand and connect to The Color of Money that I never did for all these years. But because I, got older, I got to a certain age, I had my own Fast Eddie Vincent experience where someone who, was, looking at me as someone who they were, learning from, someone who they admired, and then, eventually surpassed. And that's a tough pill to swallow. But when I watched Color of Money again more recently, and it had been the first time I'd seen it in quite a while, I went, holy shit. I did not expect to relate to this movie, but that's what happened.
It's the best quality of these underdog stories, right? Like, there is an eventual point that, like, we all kind of come to realize these experiences, because even if we can't play pool particularly well, we have those moments. We have those moments where we think we're hot shit. And then we have those moments where we get knocked off our pedestal. And how do we climb back up, or how do we accept that? And like, that's an interesting dynamic that I didn't even think about. Like, I just looked it up. I am 1 year older than Tom Cruise was when he made this movie. I believe he's about 24 when he makes this movie. I'm 25 right now. Wow. So like, there is, of course, like a relationship to the Tom Cruise. And of course, like, I have a much more personal relationship with Tom Cruise's filmography than I do Newman. Newman is not a guy who, like, obviously, like, I know who Newman is. I've watched a lot of his films, but he wasn't my movie star growing up.
Right.
He just wasn't in, I had to seek out Newman films where Tom Cruise was headlining movies every weekend when I was growing up, or every summer when I was growing up. The aspect of this movie that I think gets like underappreciated, like lost in time, I guess, to a degree, is like, this is such an important film for Scorsese, even if this is like kind of a film that he does for hire. Like, this is one of the few films where it's just like, I'll agree to do this. This was really what got him out of director's jail. Like, The King of Comedy and After Hours back to back was pretty brutal time for him. Well, and then like, you could say like 1980, like Raging Bull had this success, but the movie right before that is New York, New York. Like, right. 3 out of the 4 films he had done basically sentenced him to movie jail. And Color of Money, it's a very moderate success. It's not like this incredibly high grossing top 10 of the year, but it is kind of what allows studios to get a little bit of a trust back in Scorsese, where they're like, he can take a genre and make genre.
But
for
hang
us.
on a second. Maybe now, certainly the Color of Money is much more revered than it was in 1986. Because back in 1986, Siskel and Ebert had their TV show at the movies, and they gave it 2 thumbs down, both of them. Roger Ebert said, it's a pool room. I'm sorry, this is Gene Siskel. Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune said, Color Money is a pool room variation of the Karate Kid. And he meant
Yeah.
that at this. And then Roger Ebert at the Chicago Sun-Times said, it doesn't have the electricity of Scorsese's best work. And I was always aware of the story marching by. Also at this, Vincent Canby at the New York Times liked it and said, it's a white Cadillac among the other mainstream movies of the season. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that this was the movie that got him out of movie jail. I would say that was Goodfellas.
I think Goodfellas fully solidifies him. I think Color of Money at least allows him to be a little bit mainstream again, where post King of Comedy After Hours, it was like, this guy cannot be mainstream anymore.
Did you ever see the movie Life Itself? The documentary about
the documentary on Roger Ebert. Yes, I did.
Okay, there is a point in that film where Martin Scorsese is being interviewed, and he said the one review that hurt the most to him up to that point in his career was Roger Ebert's review of The Color of Money. He said that really hurt, and Roger Ebert told him at the time, like something like, "You're better than this." You get one movie to do it this way. You got to come back. And he, to watch Scorsese sort of have the wind taken out of his sails by a critic over The Color of Money must have been a sobering experience for him. But this was not, look, I think Scorsese's mid-'80s period with King of Comedy and After Hours and Color of Money, I think that's his most fascinating period, because those are 3 of his most underrated, his most overlooked movies that today people love. The King of Comedy, people love After Hours, and people love The Color of Money. But back then, in the 80s, after, Taxi Driver and certainly Raging Bull, and like, what the hell happened to this guy? I could see why people would have been like that with Scorsese.
There's 2 points that you brought up. One, I kind of think it's the incredibleness of Roger Ebert, where, I disagree with Roger Ebert's, because I did read his review for this movie. I disagree. He calls this movie like a movie that loses plot as it goes along, which I actually think is kind of a weird fundamental understanding of this movie. I think the movie actually gains plot as it goes along. But the thing that I respect so much about him is he and Scorsese are friends at this time. Like, they are in constant correspondence. They've kind of come up together, and that he could still write a critical analysis of a Scorsese movie and give it a negative review. That's such a difficult thing to do. Like, that is such a difficult thing to talk about an aspect of a movie, especially when you've had a personal relationship with that actor, actress, director, whoever. I've had to do that a few occasions where there's like somebody that I've met and I've been really nice to, and then I bash the movie, or like there's an interview and I'm like, they were the best interview and I just dislike this movie. Like, those are always the hardest ones to do. And the fact that it's what makes Ebert is the fact that he could do that. And like a few more points, because I know we have to start wrapping up this conversation. I don't want to skip over these names. Mary Elizabeth and, oh my gosh, I cannot pronounce her last name. How do you pronounce it?
Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio.
Yes, she is on the level of Newman and Cruise in this movie, and just the terms of what she is asked to do. Like, the scenes with her and Newman are particularly extremely interesting. I believe she gets nominated for Best Supporting Actress.
She was nominated for Supporting Actress. Tom Cruise should have been nominated for Supporting Actor. He wasn't. Tom Cruise should have been nominated for Best Actor in Rain Man. He wasn't. I think he was just such a big superstar by this point that that was actually like almost seen as like a, you know, a detriment to him. But
Yeah,
yeah, you know what I mean? Go ahead.
it's the kind of the story of Cruise's career, because I also think last year for Top Gun Maverick, it was kind of unquestionable to me that he was one of the 5 best actors last year, even if
Yeah.
he didn't necessarily deserve the win in my eyes. Like, he was so dynamic and so great in Top Gun Maverick. It's again this element that Scorsese can bring where it's just like, I love his ability to identify actors that are young and up and coming that will make a career of themselves. The fact that like John Turturro's in this scene for like 2 or 3 scenes, and the fact that Forrest Whitaker comes in and gets to kind of school Paul Newman, like that's kind of the last point that I'll kind of talk about because I know we have to wrap this up.
Okay,
But
I
this
gotta talk
Forrest
about
Whitaker
that.
scene, yeah, go for it, because I
All
this
right.
scene was one of my favorites as
And
well.
this is my favorite scene of the movie.
Oh, it is?
Where Fast Eddie Felson gets hustled.
Yeah.
He has learned nothing. Like after all of that, even going back to his time back in 1961, that scene, he is so full of himself. You know, Eddie Felson is so full of himself that he just totally uh does not see this coming. And Forrest Whitaker as Amos is so like spot on, and he keeps going, oh my God, I'm so lucky. I was so lucky. Double or Nothing. He's like, why not? And you could just see when Felson gets up and he's like, oh, did you see that? Did you see that? That was crazy. That was crazy. And when Fast Eddie says to him, are you hustling me, kid? And he goes, no, no, no. Like, he's like, are you hustling me?
Mm.
And then Whitaker breaks character and he goes, what? You want to quit?
Mm.
Felson says, fuck you, kid.
Yeah.
I mean, and then, you know, you see Amos sink more balls. And then Felson just throws the $100 bills on the table. And you know, Forrest Whitaker is like, you know, putting his pool cue away. And he goes, let me ask you a question. Do you think I need to lose some weight?
Mm.
And meanwhile, Vincent and Carmen are watching this whole damn thing go down. And just, it destroys him. It destroys him. And he's like, I got nothing else to teach you to. This was it. This was the last lesson. Here, take all the money, go. And Vincent is like, no, please don't do this. He's feeling betrayed because that's, you know, Eddie is like, you know, sending him on his way. And Eddie is like, no, this is the best thing I could possibly do to you. This was the last lesson. This is the most important lesson of all. And when Vincent takes the balabushka and he kisses it, he throws it down and he kicks the wall, and you see Tom Cruise walking up the stairs, limping. I'll bet when Tom Cruise kicked that wall, I'll bet he hurt his ankle.
Yeah.
Because when you watch that scene again and you watch Cruise walk up the steps, he's limping out of the scene. And then, you know, Carmen just takes the money and runs off. And from that point forward, it becomes Eddie Felson's movie. It becomes Paul Newman's film. That's his For Your Consideration moment right there. That scene is fantastic.
And it all like just accumulates in this incredible third act, which is, I think, the most exciting sequence of the movie, which is him like kind of training, him coming back up, him then getting hustled, or not hustled, but him finding out that Vincent throws the match.
Yeah.
And then like that whole dynamic at the end, and then him finally crying out at the end, kind of the same way Christ cries out in Last Temptation, like it is accomplished. He's like, I'm back. And then it just,
oh, that's a great scene. When he says, you know, that last scene, he says, hey, I'm back. And he breaks the shot, and the camera just freezes on him and it slowly fades to black. I always get the chills because I'll tell you one thing we did not discuss about The Color of Money, Ben, is the music, the score composed by the late, great Robbie Robertson, who just passed away at the age of 80. This is an awesome score. And that last moment when he says, I'm back, and you hear that you know, the music that opens up the film with Scorsese's narration about luck, which is excellent scene.
It's such an exciting scene. I love this ending. It is a movie that I think gets better as the film progresses. Like this is certainly one where for the first act I had to kind of get into it. Second act I see where it's going, and then third act I'm like this is fully dynamic and fully realized to me. And that might be, the more I watch it, that might be one of those ones that's kind of solved. But it is a movie that kind of starts off a little slow to me and then builds
Sure.
up to like orchestrates to something just incredible. Scott, before we kind of like wrap our discussion on Color of Money, I just was trying to think, and I was really interested in the idea of like, would Tom Cruise ever come back to this character of Vincent? Would he essentially ever do his Color of Money sequel, kind of the same way Newman did it? And I was trying to like think like who would be the director who could do the Color of Money now. I came up with one name, and I'm curious if you have any names that you're like, I think this sequel with Tom Cruise, directed by this person, would be a really interesting experience and one that I'd love to see Tom Cruise.
That would be a hell of a thing to have Paul Newman reprise a role that he played 25 years earlier, Eddie Felson. And now, I mean, now you're talking almost 40 years,
Mhm.
you know, but to have like, where is Vincent 40 years later?
Mhm.
Uh, is he even interested in pool? Is he like the greatest pool player who ever lived?
Mhm.
Knows. Is he somewhere in between? Is he teaching pool to pay the bills? Um, yeah, I would really be interested to see where Vincent is after almost 40 years. I
I
would
think
it would be easy for me to say, well, look, I mean, Tom Cruise has been doing his best work lately with Chris McQuarrie,
mhm.
who did obviously the Mission Impossible, last three Mission Impossible movies. Also Jack Reacher. Then there's Doug Liman. They did Edge of Tomorrow, which is a freaking great movie. But this is like sort of a drama. I don't know, let me think about that. But who do you got?
So I was trying to think about it. And I think what excited me most about this like thought that I was having was just like I kind of want Tom Cruise. I love his work with Macquarie. I've loved what he did in Top Gun Maverick with Joseph Kaczynski. What I was trying to think is like, you have this run of directors that I just listed. And like I'd love to see Cruise work with like another just established A-list guy. And like who could do this world so interestingly? And the name that kept coming to my mind was Ryan Coogler.
Well, Ryan Coogler did Ryan Coogler, didn't he do
He did Creed.
he did Creed. Yeah.
And I'm just like that style, that little bit older version of Cruise, like that would be such an exciting, like that was what I was trying to do. I
Yeah.
was trying to get somebody that Cruise has never worked with. I also thought the Safdie brothers real quickly, just because of what they could achieve with Uncut Gems and kind of setting it in this underground world of pool.
That would be if the Safdie brothers did that film, you get something that would be very, very stylized.
Yeah.
That would be very interesting. Can you imagine Tom Cruise working with the Safdie brothers?
That's I think like my whole
That
thing
would be
about this
amazing.
like thought of where it's just like, I really hope we get a few more performances. Like, I love Mission Impossible. I love Top Gun Maverick. They're some of my favorite films of those years. I'd love to see another Tom Cruise, like, working with a very specific type of director, doing something very offbeat, like the things that he would do, like with Stanley Kubrick, with Paul Thomas Anderson, even the guy like Michael Mann, like with Collateral. Like, I'd love to
Oh,
get one more type of performance for that. Scott, before I let you go, I have a few really important questions
let's
for you.
hear. Yeah.
My first really important question for you is, and I guess it's kind of two questions tied together. Who is an actor that you would love to see work with Martin Scorsese that is alive, and who is an actor that is no longer with us that you would have loved to get the opportunity to see them in a Martin Scorsese film? For that second question, it doesn't have to be in the time period that Scorsese was like working. Like it can be completely out of time period.
First of all, there are a few actors who I'm surprised have not yet worked with Scorsese
Mm-mm.
that I would love to see what they do with Scorsese. My number one, and I've got like four or five, I just want to run through them, but my number one actress who I would love to see work with Scorsese is Jessica Chastain.
Mm.
She is so amazing. She's my definitely one of my top 3 actors, period, working today. She is phenomenal. I
Yeah.
will watch her if she's in a film, I'm like, I don't care what it is, I will go see it. If she's doing a series like George and Tammy, I will watch it because of her, and I will discover everything else along the way. She is superb. Like, love her. She is an actor's actor all the way. Another who I sort of hold up in their regard with Jessica Chastain is Emily Blunt.
Yeah.
Another one. She's freaking awesome. She is so good. She could do anything. I just saw Oppenheimer, up until the last scene that she has, like, she really like sticks the landing.
Oh yeah, she's dynamic.
Another one is Amy Adams. These actors, Amy Adams and Jessica Chastain and Emily Blunt. Those are like, they're freaking great actors, and they've never worked with Scorsese. Neither has Ryan Gosling, who I think is awesome, and neither has Meryl Streep.
Streep is like the shocking one, right? Like, you're just like,
Yeah.
how has Streep never worked with Scorsese?
How has she never worked with Scorsese? That baffles my mind. In terms of actors who are no longer with us, all right, that took a little bit more thought, and I'm trying to think of, someone around maybe during peak Scorsese, when he was still on the rise. Are you ready for this, Ben?
Yeah.
Robert Shaw.
That's a really good answer.
Robert
really
Shaw
good answer.
Is like, he died young. I think it was like 52 when he died, or some 54, 52.
He was 51.
Oh my God. That's crazy.
Yeah, he was
like,
very
I'm
young.
older than Robert Shaw. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But Robert Shaw, like, when you look at Quint in Jaws, what Spielberg got out of him, can you imagine Robert Shaw in a Scorsese movie? That would have been, fantastic. And of course, another one who, certainly made a name for himself with Coppola. Yeah, John Cazale, from, Godfather, Godfather 2, Conversation, Deer Hunter, and Dog Day Afternoon. Those were his 5 movies. And then one more is Jack Lemmon.
I have him on the long list of, like, when I'm doing each show, I'm like, Jack Lemmon is circled to eventually be mentioned. I have 2 actors.
Go.
I have, for actor who is alive, I just decided, let's go. We already have Butch Cassidy in Color of Money. Let's go the Sundance Kid. Let's do Robert Redford. Like, I was just like, that's another, just like, he's older. I know he's not really working as much anymore. Like, I would love to see another Redford like performance like that. I think even like when he's like, he's such a bit part in Captain America, Winter Soldier, or even Endgame, and he still has that charisma. Like, he just has that wry look about him.
I love that, his performance in that movie when he, like,
I think he's so underratedly good in Winter Soldier. He's just a name that would excite me. The other name is River Phoenix, for actor who's passed. It's just, I was thinking about kind of what he gets out of Tom Cruise in Color of Money. And I was just like, one of my favorite qualities of Scorsese is being able to find a young actor, someone like a Leo, someone like a Tom Cruise, someone like even like a Robert De Niro, Harvey Keitel, even Joe Pesci, like all these Margot Robbie is another great example of like an actor that he kind of like didn't necessarily discover, but really helped bring to light. I was just like, River Phoenix, and of course River Phoenix was famous before he passed. It's just like, it would have been so exciting for him to have another role in a Scorsese or in a Scorsese film. Like, it just felt like that was a natural progression, and he would have had that had he not passed.
Totally. Yep. You're right. No, those are great choices. But I'm telling you, Jessica Chastain in a Scorsese movie, why has this not happened?
I totally agree. And listen, we are shouting out my hometown, Sacramento. She's a Sacramento native. Ryan Coogler went to Sac State. This is all Sac love today. Last question I asked before we wrap this up. I asked my guests all this, and as each time I say the same answer. I'm not revealing my list until we get to The Irishman with Keith Phipps. So I'm not going to share my top 5 today, Scott. I can tell you offline, but what is your top 5 Martin Scorsese filmography?
Okay,
This
well, number one is definitely Goodfellas. I mean, it's an easy pick, but it deserves it. Then obviously Raging Bull, movie that should have won Best Picture for 1980 instead of Ordinary People. Third is obviously Taxi Driver. I'm like, these are like the obvious ones, and they're obvious for a reason because they are great. But when I get to number four, it's the King of Comedy, and number
Yep.
five is The Color of Money.
Great list, Scott. That's the show, guys. So before I leave, Scott, I just want to give you a second. Where can the people find you?
Well, really, the best way to find me is to, follow me on Instagram at Movie Mantz and follow me on the social media site formerly known as Twitter at Movie Mantz. I mean, I post all of my work on social media, and it's just easy to just follow me on Instagram and Twitter or X. And, if you live in LA, you can watch me reviewing movies on KTLA Channel 5. I've got my Star Trek podcast called Enterprise Incidents. It is a deep dive episode by episode. We did the original series and we just wrapped the animated series for the 50th anniversary. If you love Star Trek, definitely check out my Star Trek podcast, Enterprise Incidents. You can catch me on FYC, which is for your consideration on Perry Nemiroff's YouTube channel. I'm everywhere, man. I'm trying.
Yeah, Scott, thank you so much for joining me today for The Color of Money. And we will be back for our next episode. We will have Collider's writer, Meredith Loftus, joining us for The Last Temptation of Christ. Thank you all so much for listening. My name is Ben Friedman. Take care and bye-bye.